civic history. Today we'll be talking about how autocracies work. So last time, in the video that was predating this, in the grand scheme of things, we talked about liberal democracy, what it is, what it means, and I got some suggestions that it'd be a good idea to talk about, well, what's the alternative to liberal democracy? It's the autocratic system. So autocratic is just a fancy way of saying not a democracy, but also, not say like a constitutional monarchy. A common definition of it is just a system of government used by one person with absolute power, but that's not always a good definition because some of these are, like, as you'll see, they're bureaucratic states or whatever. Now, bureaucracy does not mean tyranny. I want to get that out of the way. So this is Freedom House's ranking of the world as of 2020 about how if they're a free country, a partially free country, and not a free country. People have a lot of issues with Freedom House, but this is how they rank everything. So as I explained what autocracy is earlier, it's rule by a strong man or a rule by an unelected or sham elected. Essentially, it just means that they don't have a democratic society. Or if they do, the democratic society is heavily checked and such. Now, a lot of people use these two words, autocracy and authoritarianism, but authoritarianism has a slightly different definition, such as authoritarianism is usually defined as the strict obedience to a state power or individual. I personally don't think you can really have one without the other. I know all sorts of libertarians like to dream up societies where they have an absolute dictator, but they're all perfectly free, even though that would never work in 1,000 years outside of maybe their head. But, we all have to learn things. So here are some examples, and we'll go through each one of these. So first, we're going to talk about a guided democracy. So a good example, I picked Iran for this because though Iran has competitive elections, they have multiple parties, it's still not a free country. They have secret polices, state media is controlled. Essentially, Iran has a devotion to the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, which is what enshrines Iran as an Islamic republic. Indonesia is a guided democracy, as it has a stated national ideology of Panskrata, which is I'm not pronouncing that right, but essentially it is a nation which elections happen, but at the end of the day, there can only be so much done. Then there's an illiberal democracy, in which it's still a democratic republic, but press freedom is, I guess a perfect example would be, say you have a country and all the newspapers are all supposed to be very kind to whatever party's in power. Elections are still competitive. Opposition may win. This can also happen in a guided democracy. Opposition candidates do occasionally win in Iran, but it's very hard for them to win because the media is against them, all the corporations are against them. Separation of powers has waned. Courts are, often very heavily tied to the ruling power, but it's still essentially a democratic republic. And the common example of this, and the person who coined this term, is Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Then there's the one-party state. It's what it is on the tin. There's a single party that's in power. Sometimes they'll have independence, or, for example, China has a whole bunch of third parties, but they're in a coalition with the main party. I chose Laos because I wanted to pick a single party state that has nerd. For example, another good one is, North Korea. They have, under their Juche regime, they have multiple parties. There's the Korean Social Democratic Party, the actual ruling party, the Korean Workers' Party, and then they have the Changuish Chunggu Party, which is a religious party. But, it is interesting because oftentimes the one party states are weirdly also not they're not a classical dictatorship as we think. Like, for example, Xi Jinping is still like has stakeholders he's responsible to in China. He can be removed from power by other members of the party. But yeah, it's not. It's just weird. Politics in these nations is more about interpersonal grievances than interpersonal relationships and grievances than it is about like what does the voters think. Then there's the absolute monarchy. Uh, the king's in charge. They may have ministers, but usually they're part of the royal family. Oman, for example, is an absolute monarchy. Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy. Liechtenstein. Um, Another good one is the UAE, which is a federation of absolute monarchies. I don't think this one needs so much explaining. We've all, listened to the stories and fairy tales about monarchs. And then there's the authoritarian dictatorship. And I have a very crappy definition, but this one is a good example for like Russia or Belarus. There's an individual who is in charge of the country with absolute power. It's tyrannical. There's no freedom of the press. There's no independent trade unions. It's just state control. Uh, and usually, yes, they are a former military official. Often, though, not usually that high ranking. Very rarely do generals get to be heads of authoritarian dictatorships. It's pretty common, but in Europe, it's usually been like some guy who's a lieutenant colonel. But wait, there is sort of a weird third, sorry, like sixth thing. This is also the world as it looked in 1914, probably. The dominant party system. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing because some people argue this is a form of autocracy, but it's one party naturally wins elections and maintains power. There's a strong opposition, but for some reason, people just don't vote for them. So I put for the example the American state of Hawaii because it fits the definition of a dominant party system really well. The Democrats have almost always won Hawaii. In every single presidential election except for two, Dems have won Hawaii. Um, and the two times they lost, it was by a very slim margin. They've they've won the governorships for long periods of time. They've have nearly they have such a large majority in the state senate that the Republican Party in Hawaii has one seat. It has 5 seats in the state house. Another good example of a dominant party republic would be Japan. The Liberal Democratic Party since the 1950s has been in every government except for two. There was a third time in there where they did not have the prime ministership, but they were in the governing coalition. And some people argue this is just autocracy, but I don't know if one party just always seems to win and it's because voters just like them. Well, what's she going to do? And that's what I was going to say. They're extremely common. Texas was under the Democrats a dominant party state for the longest time. And then the Civil Rights Act happened and the Southern Strategy. Same with California, used to be a staunchly Republican state. And then Bill Clinton came along. So, anyways, thanks for watching. Just my reminder there, like, comment, subscribe, and if you're feeling generous, share the video with your friends.